Welcome to Doing Good by Doing Better, the podcast for world shapers, not spectators. I'm Margaret Rogers, CEO of Pariveda, a professional services firm that helps make potential possible for our clients. On this show, I talk with founders, executives, and innovators who share hard lessons, bold ideas, and real strategies for purpose-driven growth. This episode will offer practical insights you can use this week to solve forward, because at Pariveda, we know that doing good only endures when we keep learning how to do better. Today, I'm with Karen Brown, a former Fortune 100 executive with leadership roles at companies such as Marriott and Baker McKinsey. As founder of Bridge Arrow, Karen advises organizations worldwide on driving growth and profitability by making inclusion operational. Her ideas appear in Harvard Business Review and in her award-winning book, The Leaders You Need from MIT Press. In this conversation, Karen gets practical about tying inclusion to outcomes leaders already track. She shares the most important question to ask before big decisions so blind spots won't cost you, and the simple habits that turn quality feedback into momentum. Let's jump in. I'm so excited to have you here with us, Karen. You and I met on actually work event that was virtual. You had the most amazing voice about diversity and inclusion on that call. And Cole reached out to you and you responded, and I was ecstatic. And that's how this connection was born.
Yes, indeed. I was very pleased, and I'm always surprised, pleasantly surprised, when I have a new connection. I'm able to add value to someone's life or knowledge and vice versa. So I was really, really humbled and pleased to have this connection with you, Margaret.
Well, it's such a delight. You know, as we get started, this podcast is all about leadership. You have such a diverse background from corporate to founding your own company. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so I started in a leadership capacity immediately after graduating from university. I started with Marriott Corporation, paying my way through university as a restaurant hostess. And when I graduated, it was the time when they were starting their management program in the Courtyard by Marriott brand. And I was hired, and it made sense because I studied hospitality management and dietetics, and I worked with them in management for quite a long time, and then moved over to Sodexo, which is a food service and facilities management company. I was with them for quite a while in Washington, D.C., and it was in that role I was then tapped for a role in marketing. And while working in marketing, I had a friend who was responsible for building a new diversity division for Sodexo. When she asked me to apply, I said, absolutely not. I don't understand the word diversity. I don't understand the job description. And she came back to me again. And I said, I still don't understand what this job description mean and what you're asking of me. And my boss at the time in marketing says, Karen, you'd be great at this. And just to have them leave me alone, when my friend Elaine came back a third time just to appease them, I applied for the job. And when I got the job, I knew deep down inside of me, people talk about instincts, you know what you know when you know. I knew this is what I was born to do. And fundamentally, when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion role or inclusion or belonging role, it's really to help other people excel. That's what it is fundamentally. And I knew from I was a child at 12 years old, I wanted to help people. And so I worked in that role for quite a long time. And then I had the privilege of being appointed to other leadership roles for inclusion at Monsanto, at Baxter Healthcare, at Rockwell Collins, which is an avionics communications company. And then I went on to be the global head at Baker McKinsey, the global law firm. And while at Baker McKinsey, I ended up just being overworked and I was stressed. And I decided, I'm going to take a break. And I wanted to still continue to do the work, but wanted to do it on my own time, in my own way. And that's when I launched my consulting firm, Bridge Arrow, which is global inclusion and diversity consulting. But along the way of holding an executive role for inclusion, I always served in a board capacity, served as a board director. So I have been on boards, nonprofit boards, for about 20 years now. And I just have the time of my life getting up every day, doing what makes my heart sing, which is really to help others excel.
I love that idea about helping others excel. I always talk about, as leaders, we are accountable for creating environments that help people excel. And you spent decades transforming how organizations think about leadership and inclusion. What does inclusive leadership mean to you, and why is it essential to business performance?
Oh, yeah. Well, fundamentally, inclusive leadership for me is simply having the ability to look across difference, name all the possible differences that there are in the world when it comes to people, is to look across difference and to lead across difference in a way that let people know they are seen. That's it. That is fundamental inclusive leadership. And when people can feel confident and know that they are seen, they will be able to do anything and everything in order to excel, not just for themselves, but also for the teams they're working on. Fundamentally, inclusion work is about helping the business excel, helping the business to perform. But Margaret, you and I know it is people who do the work. It is people who make the customer experience sweet or sour. It is people who make the profit. And so businesses cannot perform, cannot excel without its people. And again, when people know that they are seen and that they're heard and that they're valued, they will be all that they can be. And that is fundamental to building trust.
I would imagine that a lot of executives have trouble measuring this inclusion as a strategic driver. It's some of the challenges we have today, even with just engagement surveys. How do you guide executives in that?
I always start with an understanding of who they are. I think marketing 101, know thy audience. I need to know who you are. I need to know some of the things that have shaped your worldview. And from there, I know how to connect with you human to human. So that is foundational to everything that I do and with all the leaders I've had the privilege of working with. Now, once I connect with you and understand you, then it's easy for me to build trust. And trust is fundamental for them to share with me what their challenges are, what their hopes, aspirations, and dreams are, what they're being held accountable for. So foundational for me is doing just that. I need to know who you are. The second thing I always want to know is, what are your business challenges? What are your business priorities and goals? Because my role is as a partner to the business leader. You are the expert on the business. You're the expert on what you're being held accountable for. I'm not, but I'm an expert on DEI. And so if I can partner with that business leader, if they can have their trust in me to help them solve their business challenges, to help them meet their goals, then it's going to be sweet sailing for both of us and for me and the team. And so what I then do after hearing their business goals and hearing their business challenges, I then can say and see where and how inclusion can help them excel. And I'll give you a good example. One leader I had the privilege of working with, his name is Mike, and I talk about it in the book, Mike at Monsanto. And when I first met with him after joining the organization, again, I asked the same questions, help me understand who you are, the things that have shaped your worldview, what are your business goals and challenges. And when I asked the question, what are your business challenges? He said, hey, Karen, I only have one woman on my leadership team. And by the way, at the time, he had responsibility for the largest business segment globally across the organization. And so I said, I don't understand what your business challenge is. And so what is your business challenge? And he repeated the question. And I still said to him, what is your business challenge that, you can share with me? And the third time I asked the question, he really heard me and he paused and I allowed the silence to sit. And then he said, all my customers around the world are men, but for most of them, the decision maker is the woman. And what they have told me is that they prefer to do business with women because they're more patient and they're better listeners. And I said, oh, now I understand your business challenge. And so you see, when he came to me, like when all leaders come to me, they're thinking about counting heads just to count heads. And they're not thinking about making heads count. And so for me, I want to understand the business challenge and I want to understand the why they have the business challenge. And then I'm able to say, all right, this is how through inclusion, I can help you meet that business challenge. And we had the most wonderful and dynamic relationship from there on. I worked more with him as a business leader than any business leader I have ever worked with in my entire 28 plus year career as a DEI leader. So that's a very simple example of how I approach my work and get business leaders to see the value of inclusion to business performance.
I love that story. I would imagine that driving this kind of cultural and systematic change often meets a lot of resistance. And when you think about just in your portfolio of work, what have been some of the toughest challenges that you've faced embedding that kind of strategy in an organization? How did you deal with that?
When I'm working with an organization and the word values and company values has been coming up a lot over the last 5 years. So starting around 2020, the murder of George Floyd, but even going back to the Me Too movement, the word values have come up a lot. And I have to be honest with you, Margaret, I don't connect my work to values at all. Values are a constellation of behaviors. And I've only worked with one company in my career where values was truly driving our business goals or performance, how we were measured, the work that we did. And so I even recall having a conversation once with my HR VP of a global company that's well known, asking him about what can we do and how can we connect DEI to the values of the organization. And he had no clue, because what I have found in my work, even before working in DEI, is that many companies really don't focus on the values that are beautifully displayed on their websites and beautiful brochures. And I'm reminded of the late Madeleine Albright, who once said, values are like wallpaper. They're beautiful to look at. They're nice. But if people aren't demonstrating those behaviors, if they're not held accountable for those behaviors, if they're not hired around those behaviors, it's dismissal from the organization, is not connected to values, they're just beautiful to look at. And what I have found is that they're just beautiful to look at. Values for me are also very soft and mushy. They're important, they're soft and mushy, but that's a second issue I have found, which is why I don't connect DEI to values. Because of my mindset as a business leader, because I came up for the business. I ran the business, and therefore I think about the business first. And I also know that it is the senior leaders and the board, they're thinking business first. So for me, I always connect DEI to the business and never to values. Maybe it's a mistake, but I have found success in always connecting it to, again, know thy audience first, what business leaders care about, which are the business goals. That's what reported on a quarterly basis in earnings calls. That's what's reported to shareholders. So I don't connect it to values.
In your experience, then, what are the common mistakes leaders make when trying to advance inclusion, and how can they avoid them? I know you talked about not thinking about the business, but thinking about the numbers or headcount and reducing it to that kind of measurement, what other big common mistakes have you seen leaders do in this space?
There are many they make. There's an article I wrote that's on my website, ejara.com, the 12 deadly sins of inclusion work. I will, however, highlight these three when it comes to the leadership of an organization. Number one, a board and a CEO would never hire or appoint a CFO based on the identity box they check. A manager would never hire a barista based on the identity box she or that person checks. Yet, when it comes to inclusion work, a lot of leaders appoint a leader for inclusion based on the identity box they check. And because of that, there are lots of challenges. So you have someone who don't have an understanding how to do the work. They focus on the wrong things. And it's just a multiplier effect from there on out. So that's one thing. Another huge challenge that I've always seen is that they focus on what others are doing. So what are the competitors doing? What are my other colleagues doing? What's the latest and the greatest? What's best practice that's out there? And to me, that is an issue because we don't know that the results they're getting are good results. We don't know why they have chosen the competitors or what is considered best practices are truly best practices. We don't know the connection to who they are and what they do. And I've always found that my company goals are always in alignment with who we are and where we're trying to go and what we're trying to achieve. And so focusing on what others are doing for the sake of focusing on what others are doing and then copying what they're doing is never a smart decision. And the third thing that I would offer is that they allow for goals or programs across the organization. And none of these things have anything to do with helping employees to perform better, helping them to be more innovative, helping them to be more engaged or even productive. They have nothing to do with helping the business perform better. And so these are things that are just not productive or useful for the business or for the people.
I would imagine with your array of experiences that there are a lot of lessons learned. One of the things about Pariveda is you have to have time to reflect on your work and bring it more integrated into yourself so that you can move forward and be better. What is an experience that you had that you carry with you, whether it be a turning point or a lesson learned that taught you something that you carry into your work for your clients?
I recall shortly after joining an organization, we had our quarterly global town hall. And being new to the organization, I was asked to give an update on our work and the path forward. As I normally do, I prepared meticulously and I gave my presentation and got great and glowing reviews on my performance. And then my manager came to me and said, I did quite well. However, his boss provided the feedback that I was too polished. Yeah, Margaret. Yeah.
Wow.
And I heard the feedback and perplexed, I accepted it as a gift, because that's the way I see feedback. And so I asked, well, I hear you and I understand what the feedback is, but what am I supposed to do with that? And he shot back, I don't know. And so today, when I am talking with leaders at all levels of an organization, one of the things I talk about is the importance of giving quality and meaningful feedback to people. There are numbers of studies that are out there. The latest one I looked at came out about a year and a half ago, that women, people who fall in underrepresented groups such as Hispanics, Latinos, Blacks, Asians, and people over 40, that includes me, often don't get quality and meaningful feedback. And my example is a perfect example of what I mean by not having quality feedback. What am I supposed to do with that? And by the way, what is wrong with being polished, especially when you are new to an organization? And so the other thing that I share with leaders, because I hear this a lot, I talk with, coach, mentor, give a lot of workshops to people at all levels of an organization. And another common feedback I get is that leaders don't spend any time at all giving feedback. And so those are the two things that I offer to leaders and managers. Just asking one question on a weekly basis. What do you need? Do you need anything? And if so, how may I help you? What inspires you? What are some of the barriers you're facing? Those very simple questions in a very casual check-in can provide insight into what an employee will need, and then moving the barriers from their ability to perform.
Yeah, I love that author, Kim Scott. She wrote Radical Candor. And I heard her on a podcast once where she said she actually had an employee that said, "Why didn't you give me feedback when you knew it was going to be hard, essentially? And don't you care about me?" was the statement from the employee who was being let go. And she carried that with her. That inspired her to do these studies and write that book. And I think that's huge. At the end of the day, we're all human and we care about the people we work with. So it's hard to give them feedback.
It is hard to give. One way to characterize it is tough feedback. Another way to characterize it, unpleasant feedback. However we characterize it, I recognize it's hard. And giving feedback for me is one way of showing care. You have a heart and you care about how it will land. But what is not okay are two things. One, not giving the feedback. And two, delay giving the feedback. Because often what I have seen, heard, experienced is something happened 6 months ago, and now it's mid-year review or it's the end of the year, and I'm just hearing about something I did 6 months ago. Well, I had no time to correct this behavior or change the course of action or change how I should up in the workplace. And so I have learned a lot about feedback. And there are many frameworks that are out there that people can use. One is I see feedback as a gift. And so if you can package it in a way that doesn't hurt the person, so taking time to select the right words and phrase and the behavior behind giving the feedback is really important. Package it as a beautiful gift that you would want to receive. So that's one thing. There's a framework, there are two frameworks that I particularly like. One is grow and glow. And I like to start with the glow. When you glow, this is what I see. When I think of growth for you, this is how I see you growing if you can work on X, Y, Z. So glow and grow. Another framework I continuously use till this very day was developed by a former boss of mine, and it's called the brag framework. And it's something like this. When I brag about you, again, always start with the positive. When I brag about you, this is what I say. When I wonder about you, I'm wondering really is connected to potential. When I worry about you, this is what I worry about. And so this is where you link the area for improvement. And when I bet on you, I bet on you excelling at X, or I bet on you achieving X, Y, Z by a certain time frame. And the book is written by Steve King. So it's out there online, and it's a former boss of mine. And again, I have used it since I learned about it many years ago.
I really love the structure of that, which gives them preparation to receive the feedback, the gift. And I think you're 100% right. I think we need to be more thoughtful to wrap the gift appropriately so that they are ready to receive it. Yeah. I see a lot of shifts in leadership expectations today. We see it in a lot of articles. They say that leaders have to run faster, they have to adapt, they have to be broader in their skills and expertise while being deep. Like, I'd love to get your perspective on what you think is happening with the expectation of leadership today, and what kind of leaders do we need for the future?
Oof, oof. That's such a big one, Margaret. And it's a tough one. And here's why it's tough. You and I know that things in our world today, both business and personal, are shifting by the hour because of the environment that we're living through here in the US. It is just constantly shifting hour by hour. And I say that because I spend most of my time talking with, listening to business leaders, and they share what it's like for them. They are confused. One university president confided that he wished he could be ill so that he won't have to go to work. One CEO shared it's crippling not knowing what's coming next. And so business leaders are constantly in knots and on the edge, and knowing that when they wake up in the morning and by the time they get to their office, whether it's virtual or not, something is going to be very different hour by hour. So it's therefore very hard for us to then guide leaders about how to show up today, other than saying it's really incredibly important that you are comfortable with ambiguity. It's really very important that you're comfortable with change. It's really important that you're comfortable leading with not knowing what's going to happen. And it's important to instill calm and model what it is to be calm and what it is to model confidence in thyself and in the team about where they are, the shifts that are coming. And part of that is simply saying, I don't know. I don't know it all. I don't know what's coming, but we will be okay. And look to the past for when the organization or where the industry, or even when we as a country have faced situations where we didn't know what was coming, where we had no control. And all we have control over is how we showed up each day and how we led our team and how we motivated them and how we excited them and how we painted a vision that is still true to who we are as an organization. And I look to COVID time as a great example in our recent history of when we didn't know what was coming. The future was unknown to all of us. And yet here we are, just a few years out of that. And so that time can teach us about how we can navigate where we are and how we move forward. So when I talk with leaders, these are just some of the things that I talk about. And it's also what I'm seeing other highly respected leaders and organizations talk about, whether it's through MIT, whether it's through HBR and their articles and well-respected companies. These are just some of the things that I'm advising leaders and managers and even employees today.
That's amazing. What do you think about data and how it plays in inclusion, especially at a sustainable scale? Like, how should leaders hold themselves accountable actually in this process, especially now that data is really starting to drive our world with the rise of Gen AI? You can't throw a rock without hitting something that says Gen AI. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about the data, and I'm also curious about what you're worried about.
Let me start with the data piece. Whether or not the bonus this year is based on numbers, the resources one receives to manage the business are based on numbers. Some of us manage our health by numbers, or household is managed by numbers. The language of business is numbers, facts over feelings. Math has no emotions. And this is one of the things that I talk a lot about in my book. It's the fourth pillar in my framework in my book: define objectives and outcomes with data. And so every decision that I've always made when it comes to my inclusion work, it's always starting with data. So I use data analytics as insights for decision making. And the second thing that I always do when it comes to data and inclusion, I start with the data that the board and that the C-suite are focused on. And I'll give you a good example of that. When I was at the law firm Baker McKenzie, quarterly, our CFO reported out on our data, and productivity was one of them. How are we overall as a law firm? How are we performing by office, by geography, by different groups? And so I made a note of that. There was also a well-established saying and thinking across the firm by mostly the men, the lawyers. And it is that women were not as productive as men. And so at one of the quarterly meetings, I noticed that we were not reporting productivity by gender. And so I went to our CFO and I said to the CFO, could we possibly report productivity by gender? And he said, let me talk with the team. And so the answer was yes. And what we found was very insightful, because we found that our women lawyers were just as productive as the men. Now, imagine all the decades of operating as a law firm where that belief was strongly held, how it impacted the women. It meant that they didn't get exposure to key work and clients, development, key leaders across the firm. And what is interesting is that we were working on globally closing the gaps between the men and the women in leadership and at two different partnership levels. And so this strongly held belief naturally was holding women back. And so when I see representation or underrepresentation of a particular group, everybody wants to tackle it by counting heads. I want to understand the why beneath it. Why is there a gap? And that was one way of knowing why we had this gap. Now, there were other things as well that were causing this gap across the organization. And so understanding the other whys, we were then able to begin to focus on the right solutions in order to close these gaps. And so it was really eye-opening. And it's a perfect example of when you use data analytics as insights for decision making, and you focus on starting with what the organization is already focused on, and you tie it to the goals of the organization. Now, what I worry about, and I've alluded to it, the focusing on counting heads just for counting heads' sake. The fact that there is, and if we go back to the Mike at Monsanto example, because there is underrepresentation, doesn't tell me why you have a gap. It doesn't tell me that it's important for you to have more women on the organization just because there's underrepresentation. And so I struggle with just the counting of the heads without understanding the why. And part of the reality, and I think you can understand this, Margaret, there is not always opportunity. You cannot create opportunity out of thin air. So you have to have opportunity for placement. You can't just create a job opening and appoint people. And nobody wants to be appointed because of their identity box. I have never met one person in my entire career who wants to be appointed because of their identity box. And so I struggle with, again, just counting heads as opposed to making heads count. I struggle with, because this does happen, I struggle with appointing people because of their identity box. My hope is that the difficult time we're going through right now with inclusion work, this is a moment to really pause and reflect and conscientiously connect inclusion work to the reason why you are in business. Connect it to the goals that you have, and not just do it because everybody else is doing it or because it's the right thing to do only. Make it more than a moral imperative. Make it about your business and the performance of your people.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, especially as you scale, right? One of the difficulties that organizations have is it might start as a nice star inside an organization, but getting it to scale out is really difficult. Any tips on how organizations should be thinking about that when they have their first success?
When I think about scaling, there's so many examples of working for companies, and we were growing in very different ways. Again, I start with understanding what our priorities are. What are my leaders focused on? What is the board focused on? Because the truth is, we cannot focus on everything, everyone, everywhere, all at once. We can't. That's why we have typically 3 to 5 strategic goals. And I'll give you 2 very quick examples. One, I once worked with an insurance company, and the head of M&A was talking to me. It was an introductory call. I was interviewing him to understand the goals and the struggles for the organization. And instantly, without prompting at all and completely out of context, he said, Karen, we don't hire people from within. And it's possibly he was thinking that I'm going to coach him about counting heads. And so I said, I hear you. Tell me about your M&A process. And so he told me about the M&A process. And immediately after telling me, he had an aha. And so this is what he said. Well, we grow by buying small companies. And I said, And when we are ready to grow, which we always are focused on growth, we go to the bankers with whom we have business and strong relationships, and we tell them what we're looking for and tell them to go out and find it and buy it. And I said, And then he said, oh my God, the people we have relationships with at the bank are all white men. And so I asked him, are you aware of the numbers of small companies that are owned by all these different categories, people with disability, based on religion, based on sexual orientation, gender identity expression? I asked him all of those, and he said, no. And that's all it took to connect, again, inclusion to this company that is always focused on growth. And so you see how I shifted it away from counting heads to making heads count. Another very good example I'll offer is when I was at Monsanto, we were growing from 15 billion to 25 billion in 5 years. We knew we could do it because we had done it before. And 3 growth areas were India, Eastern Europe, and Brazil. And I didn't know what I was going to find. And I asked for the demographic data from the board level all the way down to the person on the factory floor. And I asked the team to cut the data in as myriad of ways as possible: tenure in organization, geography, language spoken, gender, the typical ones. And once I had the data and I looked at our growth plan, I took it to our COO and I showed him the data and I showed him the growth plan. And I said, what do you see? And he processed it for a while. And after a couple of minutes, he says, oh, I get it now. So what was happening is the highest Latino was 4 levels removed from the board. So we had no Latino representation on the board, none on the C-suite. And so when we look at Brazil, he realized we had nobody in the organization who had the ability to influence in Brazil. We had no one in the organization in position of power who spoke the language in Brazil. And I have to be honest and confess, I wouldn't have come up with this as a solution, which is why I stay in my lane of inclusion and let the business leaders be who they are. And in their wisdom, the board appointed and the C-suite appointed board member in Brazil. And this company had been around for over 150 years, and never, ever had they had someone of that ethnicity box on the board, and never had they had a board member who was outside of the USA. So both stories are really good examples of what the influence and power inclusion can have on a business when it's scaling, when it's growing. It doesn't matter who they are, what they do. And I will point out that notice both examples and all the other examples that I talk about in my book are all B2B examples. And so if I can do it in B2B, it's really easy to do it in B2C.
I love that. All right. So Karen, we're going to enter a lightning round, just a quick series of questions that you'll kind of answer with the first thing that comes to your head. So you ready? All right. A book you often recommend?
I don't ever recommend the same books. I think by now, Margaret, you can tell that I focus on the person in front of me. And so I will always recommend a book based on the person's interest. And that's just my style. I will always recommend as a theme the importance of knowing thyself and knowing others. And I would highly recommend, if anybody is interested in just understanding about all the cultures in the world, the book I just finished over the weekend is Reading Lolita in Iran. Oh, it is a brilliant book.
Oh, I read about that book. I haven't read it myself, but that's great to hear that recommendation. What's a favorite quote?
Oh, when all is said and done, let more be done than said. I am by nature, I have a bias for action. So, forget all the talk. I care more about action, and I'm driven by evidence.
What's a habit you live by?
Oh, I'm most comfortable when I'm uncomfortable. And so I seek wisdom, knowledge, experiences that will always make me highly uncomfortable, because that's how I'm reminded of the importance of humility. It sharpens my patience skills, and it certainly sharpens my empathy skill.
I love that. So where can listeners learn more about you or your work?
Yes, I have a website. You can learn about my work, my book, The Leaders You Need, published by MIT Press, on my website, bridgearrow.com. I am also on social media, LinkedIn. In fact, I have 2 giveaways that will be posted on LinkedIn. One is an audio version of my book, and the other is a free keynote speech. So watch LinkedIn for that announcement.
That's fantastic. And then finally, what's a takeaway or encouragement for leaders who are working to scale inclusion while staying grounded in what they believe?
Yeah, 2 words. Always ask these 2 words. And I would say build a habit of asking these 2 words. Who's missing? Fundamentally, that's what inclusion is about. Understand and closing the gaps of those who are missing. They could be in the room and their voices are not heard. Who's missing? They could be not in the room because they were not invited intentionally and unintentionally. Who is missing? If you're working on a global program or initiative or product, whose voice is missing? Are your customers, this is both, it doesn't matter who the stakeholder is, whether it's internal or external, always ask who's missing. Build that habit personally and build that habit amongst the people with whom you do business and you're leading. And I'll slip in one tiny example. When you build a habit of who's missing, you're really modeling curiosity. And I had one senior leadership team from an organization, when I did a workshop with them, they confessed to me that they never asked their clients what they need. They've always gone to their clients and told the clients what they think they need. And so, clearly they were never asking who's missing, because who was missing are their clients' voice.
Thank you so much, the wonderful Karen Brown. You can see her at bridgearrow.com or buy her book, The Leaders You Need. So make sure you do both. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure, Margaret. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Doing Good by Doing Better. I'm Margaret Rogers, CEO of Pariveda, and I hope this conversation offered you a new way to take your ideas to impact. Follow on Apple or Spotify and join us every other week as we keep learning how to do good by doing better.